I also want to introduce now Karen Mish. She is a professor in OLPD, teaching higher ed law is her specialty. She's an attorney, and I'm sure some of you know her and have had her as an instructor, but she's going to take us through the legal basis and all of that.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you to Carmen and the other folks at the University Student Legal Services for inviting me today. I'm really excited that we're having this conversation, and I think that's, if there's any takeaway from my talk today, I hope it's that we need to continue to have a lot of dialogue on these issues. So the title here is Free Speech versus Hate Speech. And I added a colon because you have to add a colon. And so it's the First Amendment on campus. As Carmen said, I do have a legal background. I'm not licensed to practice in Minnesota. So although you may really want to ask me for legal advice, probably not the best situation, to ask for legal advice when we're being filmed, and also, in a group with a lot of people, but also I'm not allowed to give it because I'm not licensed in Minnesota. I do have a Juris Doctor. I do teach higher education law here at the University of Minnesota in organizational leadership, policy, and development, and this is an area of scholarship for me as well. But I'm also, like many of you, a member of the University of Minnesota community, and I'm a scholarly practitioner. So how many folks today are here wearing their student hat? We all wear a lot of different hats. How many people are here wearing a student hat? Great. How many people are here maybe also with a student hat, but also as a practitioner? Somebody in housing, student affairs, other aspects on campus? Okay. Anybody here who's a reporter? No? Darn. We're filming it though, so that's good. Anyone, let's see, students? Regents, members of the public, interested in the topic? All right, great. Well, welcome. And we are being filmed, so if you do ask a question, and I certainly encourage you to ask questions and make comments, I'll try as hard as I can to paraphrase you accurately and then respond and get a discussion going. So I always like to start with a framing question, and for me, the question really, whenever I think about this topic, is how do we promote free speech on our campus and an inclusive campus climate, whether that's a positive campus racial climate or a climate and an environment and a culture that is not just welcoming, but actually is a space where we all have freedom to learn and freedom of inquiry. Because welcoming someone seems to suggest that they have to fit in with what we're already doing, right? So in this space of free speech, we also, because we're on a university campus, talk about academic freedom and responsibility. And I like to think about those two together because when we talk about free speech, we also have a responsibility. That's an awesome freedom. Along with it comes some responsibility. Same thing with academic freedom. And here at the University of Minnesota, our academic freedom and responsibility policy covers everyone at the university, staff, faculty, students, administrators, and it gives us an opportunity to learn and inquire without a lot of internal or external constraints. But along with that also comes a responsibility. And the idea behind academic freedom as a concept and free speech as a concept is through a clash of ideas, we're going to come out with truth or truths. We're going to come to better solutions and better ideas. But we also know that it's equally important to have an environment where we can do that and not feel that we're being discriminated against, harassed, stalked, those types of things, right? So we need both of them. And so how do we do that? How do we make sure that we have a really vibrant, inclusive campus community and that free speech helps us do that? How do we do those two things together? So that's my framing question. I, unfortunately, in our time today, don't think we're going to solve this maybe, but we're having the conversation, and that's really important. And one thing that I particularly appreciate about the way this session has been put together is that I'm going to talk about the law and some of the views about it, and we'll look at some campus scenarios, but then we have an opportunity for more small group conversation led by some very talented facilitators to continue the conversation, and I think that's really important. So a map of what I'm going to do today is look at some recent data that provides some perceptions of college students regarding free speech on campus. And then use that to segue into an overview of what the state of the law currently is around free speech, whether hate speech is protected or unprotected speech. And then we'll look at least one campus scenario to give us an opportunity to walk through some of this and think about not just what the law says, but also, again, thinking about an inclusive campus community where we all have the freedom to learn and inquire. That is, we can actually exercise our academic freedom and responsibility. What other things can and should we do? All right. So the first question that I want to look at from a recent Brookings Institute survey, was a random sample of college students across the country, was they asked students whether the First Amendment protects hate speech. And the majority of students said that it did, all right? Now, it might protect hate speech, or it might not protect hate speech. Excuse me, a majority of students said it did not, but it was pretty close. 48-52. Most students thought that hate speech could be censored, could be in some ways managed or reprimanded on a college campus, but a healthy group also thought that it wasn't protected by the First Amendment. This wasn't whether they thought it should be or not, it was, do you think the First Amendment protects hate speech? And we'll see that except in certain circumstances, the First Amendment does protect what many of us would think of as hate speech. That doesn't mean that's the end of the discussion. There's other things we can do when hateful speech is on our campus. All right. College students, and we're going to come back to this one as our scenario, so spoiler alert, so be ready to be thinking about this one as we walk through. Not a difficult one to probably have on your mind right now because it's very much in the news. So we have a public university inviting a controversial speaker to an on-campus event. The speaker is known for making offensive and hurtful statements. A student group opposed to the speaker disrupts the speech by loudly and repeatedly shouting so that the audience cannot hear the speaker. And then the students were asked, do you agree or disagree that the student group's actions are acceptable? Majority of students thought this was an acceptable thing to do, that you could shout down a speaker, all right? Yet, if you're familiar at all with our campus conduct code, you might initially be asked to leave if you do this, and then if you refuse to leave, there may be further and further ramifications, right? So, so again, we can think about where these perceptions come from, but this is what many college students thought was an acceptable behavior. Disturbing for those of us who deal in the law, I think, was that 19% of students thought that it would be okay if a student group opposed to a speaker used violence to keep the speaker from speaking. Now, keep in mind, 81% thought that was not acceptable at all, but 19% thought it was. And that's something we need to be thinking about. And it's an important context for us to understand as we think about what the First Amendment protects and what it doesn't protect. And then here we have another one. Consider an event hosted at a public U.S. university by an on-campus organization featuring a speaker known for making statements that are hurtful, right? We're back to that one. A student group opposed issues a statement saying that under the First Amendment, the on-campus organization hosting the event is legally required to ensure the event includes not only the offensive speaker, but also a speaker who presents an opposing view. What is your view on this statement? Well, most students thought this was accurate. The majority thought that you could legally require someone to have to give equal time to the opposing view. But in actuality, the law does not require that. So again, interesting perception. And then last but not least, the survey asked students if you had to choose one of these two options, which one would you choose? Option 1 was more popular. It was chosen by more students. Create a positive learning environment for all students by prohibiting certain speech or expression of viewpoints that are offensive or biased against certain groups of people. A smaller group, but still a large group of students said, create an open learning environment where students are exposed to all types of speech and viewpoints, even if it means allowing speech that is offensive or biased against certain groups of people. And this really gets to that, is hate speech protected speech? Should it be protected speech? How are the courts and university campuses and students and faculty and staff and administrators grappling with these issues, right? But again, this is giving us just a snapshot of what students nationally, and if the survey is accurate on our campus as well, some of their views about free speech. Okay. So I want to segue now into looking at some of the First Amendment law, and this is based on case law. You're not going to see a lot of citations on here, but if you would like them, you can ask for a copy of my slides, and I'd be happy to share them. Okay. So the First Amendment is really what we're talking about here, and that's why all of those scenarios were public universities, because the First Amendment right to free speech covers us at public entities, but not necessarily private. Some private schools have adopted First Amendment language, but it's contractual. It's not because of the Constitution. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Sometimes religion and speech cases get mooshed, that's a legal term, mooshed together a little bit. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or, and this is what we're interested, abridging freedom of speech or the press, or the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress. So peaceful assembly and free speech are often tied together because I can go into my office and talk to myself, but chances are when I'm trying to exercise my right to free speech, I want other people to hear me. And so I might do that electronically, I might do it in a setting like this, I might do it in a conversation in a classroom. Okay. So again, campus incidents sometimes appear and actually do pit individual constitutional rights against the need for an inclusive campus climate and maintaining productive learning environments and or group rights, right? So we often see these as an either or. And what I'm hoping that we can be thinking about is how each of those can actually support the other so that it's an and. So is there an absolute right to free speech in the United States? Could I stand up here and say anything I wanted today? I might do it, but am I protected for anything? No, right? So there's conditions that apply. And so anybody know of any of those? So let's shout them out and I'll repeat them into the microphone. What are some of the things that I might have thought about, which I didn't, but that would not, if I was to blurt them out right now, would not be protected speech? What are some of those things?
Threat.
A threat, yes. A true threat is not protected. Slander, absolutely. I can't intentionally lie about you. And if I did it right now, it would be, because now I'm, letting somebody else know. If I write it down, I could slander or defame someone if it's found to be false and I knew it or should have known. That's not protected.
False emergency.
A false emergency, yeah. If I was, but I'm not, shouting fire in a crowded theater. Now, there's never been a case, because we have looked, where someone did that and it made its way to the court. But it's the example that's often used, right? What else?
Fighting words.
Fighting words, yeah. Those that by their very utterance make you want to hit me in the nose. It actually is, it would incite you to an imminent breach of the peace. That requires an immediate action, or that it would be reasonable to have that immediate action. So fighting words, yeah. And one that sometimes comes up is obscenity, right? Which the courts literally said they know it when they see it. So it's not absolute. However, we can't prohibit it just because we have a disagreement with the content or we dislike it. It's not enough that it's offensive to us to say that, okay, we can ban that or we can keep you from repeating it. So it's not absolute. There is a lot of, well, there's some areas anyway, that are unprotected by the First Amendment, but that isn't broad enough to cover things that we just don't like. And when you think about it, there's a beauty in that, because what I don't like, you might really like, and what you really like, I might not. And so the unprotected speech is trying to deal with those things that socially we view as very harmful speech, and then protect others even though we may not like the viewpoint. So, unprotected speech includes those incitement of imminent disruption and breach of the peace, better known as fighting words, defamation and slander, true threats of violence. Now here you do need some specific information. So it's not just a threat, it's a true threat. And we can certainly talk about that if folks have questions. Again, fighting words, obscenity, discriminatory harassment is not protected speech. It's rare that you have a racial or gender harassment case where there isn't also conduct, but even pure speech that's very harmful and that there's a pattern and practice of. So we have some cases, for example, where people had locker rooms in their workplaces and somebody kept posting very offensive photographs, not obscene, but offensive photographs on the women's locker rooms in a male-dominated field, and the court there said that was sexual harassment, right? So those posters were actually speech, but because of the context and the nature of how they were used, the court ultimately found those to be not protected because it met the threshold of discriminatory sexual harassment. We've also seen similar cases, unfortunately, in a variety of contexts, and not just the workplace, and we've also seen those same types of things with racial harassment, right? But that's not protected speech. And then we also have one that's particular to our community, which is a substantial disruption of learning. And the idea here is that the court is going to balance the speech and the right to free speech with the learning environment. And we'll come back to this, but again, I teach higher education law here at the University of Minnesota. In fact, I teach it this evening. And if one of you wanted to come to that class tonight and burst in the door and start saying a bunch of things, I could prohibit that. A, because it's a classroom, and the type of free speech that we have on this campus is we can restrict that when it's in an actual classroom, right? But what if you're standing right outside my door doing it? Well, we can restrict that too, because now we can't hear each other, we can't learn. It's why we have certain restrictions on campus about using microphones and megaphones and those types of things, right? Okay. So we can require students and staff and faculty to adhere to reasonable, content-neutral rules regulating time, place, and manner in what is a university campus, which legally we talk about as being a public forum or a limited public forum. So once you open up a public forum, and we have, the bridge is a public forum. Think of all the folks and the paintings that they do on the bridge every fall. The mall is a public forum. Many of our open spaces are public forums where people can come and express themselves. And we promote that. We promote it through having student organizations. We promote it by inviting people onto our campus. We promote it because of our land-grant tradition. But we can have some content-neutral rules regulating that. So the one that I mentioned before is, in my classroom, I can actually regulate people coming in and out if they're not enrolled, making too much noise for us to be able to hear each other, those types of things. That has nothing to do with their speech. I do that if anybody is screaming outside my door, right? Hopefully no one's screaming inside the classroom. Okay. We can have reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions when you can use a particular area, how loud you can be, whether you can amplify your voice or not. Those types of things are considered to be neutral. But I think one of the things that happens sometimes when you think about content neutral rules is that we think as university staff, faculty, and students that we have to be neutral. You still have a right to...
I found this on the web.
Oh my God. Sorry. So I just wanted to make sure I had enough time and my phone was like, what is going on here? So sorry about that. She talks to me periodically. We don't necessarily have to be neutral. And what I mean by that is if someone does come to our campus and is speaking out on something, it doesn't mean that because we work here, for example, that we can't say anything about it, all right? So keep that in mind. It means that we need to treat speakers who come to our campus the same in the way in which we have these neutral time, place, and manner restrictions, but it doesn't mean that we have to agree with them or remain silent, all right? So again, we limit a lot, including online, the instructional content and that context. And I, as an instructor, can, with my students, set ground rules that in the classroom that I might not be able to do out on the mall, but that we can have in our classroom. That doesn't mean that students don't disagree with each other and me about the cases. But it does mean that we try to argue about the idea and not the identity of the person or the person themselves, right? We try to create an environment where all of us can debate and learn together. And that means sometimes taking a moment and you know, everybody does a free write or something and then we come back to a topic. Again, it's a classroom setting, it's an instructional setting. So what might be a absolutely free speech at a peaceful protest is not always gonna work in a classroom, right? We don't just shout slogans at each other or something like that. Not that that's what protests are always about. Okay. So let's look at some of these scenarios. Let's come back to the public university who invites a very controversial speaker. And let's start with a public university that doesn't invite the controversial speaker. The controversial speaker invites themselves to campus. And the university doesn't want this person to come, right? Can we keep them from coming? And if we can't, what might we do? If we are really, you know, again, this is a very, you can imagine on a variety of spectrums of the political spectrum, someone who is very controversial. What are some of the things that we might do? Okay, so at the risk of having my phone talk to me again, I'm going to set a little timer for you, and I'd like you to turn to the person next to you or behind you or in front of you, however you want to do it, and think about together for the next 2 minutes your suggestions, because law moves very quickly here, okay? So can we keep this person from coming? Should we try to keep them from coming, and legally could we? And if not, what kinds of things should we do around this event that's going to be on our campus? We know that we can't force them to have equal time, right? That just doesn't exist. So we can't say, well, you are inviting this controversial speaker, so now you have to invite these other 4 people that have different perspectives and give them equal time. We can't force the person who wants to come to do that. It's just not part of the First Amendment law anymore, if it ever was. But would there be ways to keep that person from coming to campus? Or let's say we want them to come, or we have to let them come, what kinds of things could we do to, again, promote free speech and an inclusive campus climate? So maybe I'll give you 4 minutes. Okay, talk amongst yourselves. All right, well, believe it or not, that's 4 minutes. I hate to cut in because I can tell there's some great conversation, but remember, in about 10 minutes, we're going to have some facilitated dialogue as well, so really looking forward to that. So the first question, and some people, because I always walk around the room, some people were like, well, who comes who's not invited? Well, actually, this happens. We have people who say, hey, I'd like to give a talk on your campus, and I need a room to do it, and they go through the room scheduling and those kinds of things. So sometimes that happens, and then we realize, oh, this person who wants to come and give a talk on our campus, wow, they're very controversial. And on some campuses, when this has happened, they've said, no, you can't have space. So if a public university was to do that, what do you think would happen? Or what has happened? Yeah?
The speaker sues the university.
Yes, the speaker sues the university or threatens to sue the university, which sometimes has the same effect. So again, unless we can point to unprotected speech, just because we don't agree with the speaker doesn't give us enough to say you can't come. Okay, so they're coming. Yeah, question in the back or comment?
So I have a question about the use of space for a public university. So is it because it's a public university, they have to allow someone to use that space or rent that space?
Excellent question. So because we're a public university, the question is, do we have to allow people to use our space? Well, we have allowed people to use our space, so now we have to allow people. No, it's seriously, now we have to. So the minute that you open your space up, and legally we call this a public forum or a limited public forum, once you do that and you're legally considered to be that, you can't pick and choose based on viewpoint who you're going to allow, unless you can show a true threat of violence, for example. We also, because it might cause a substantial disruption to our learning environment, we might have some other neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. You can only come at this time of day. You can only speak inside. We don't want you outside, because you think about here on our campus and many campuses across the country, oftentimes where a speaker would want to give a speech outside, there's classroom buildings all around, and that can be very noisy and disruptive. So we might have some reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and in fact, this university and every public university I've ever looked at their guidelines have policies around reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. We can also ask you to register. We can ask for certain information from you in doing that. We can ask you to do that a certain amount of time in advance so we can prepare ourselves. But once we've opened ourselves up and said that outside groups can come to campus, then we have to make sure that we're being content neutral in how we decide who and who can't come. Yeah. good point. Now, if we'd have never done that, we might be having a different conversation, and that's why private universities often have tools that publics don't. But taking away, and this is hopefully a conversation for a little bit later today, the question of should we try to keep the controversial speaker off, most likely we can't, unless, again, we have some true threat of violence, some sort of imminent incitement and imminent breach of the peace. And again, these are very fact-specific and context-specific types of questions that we would be looking into. But otherwise, the person can come to campus, all right? So let's assume that they sign up to use some space. We agree, of course. We provide that space. What other things might we think about doing? Because we know in advance this person's very controversial. Yeah?
I would say open a forum after the speech and have like members of the campus or a student group talk about it afterward in a constructive manner. And also having a conversation with the student population about listening prior to the controversial speaker coming, because that opens up a dialogue then.
Okay. So I'm going to paraphrase, and I'm not going to get it quite as wonderfully as you expressed it, but the idea in the back was we should consider having a forum. Maybe it's run by students, maybe there's a variety of facilitators there, where we do a debrief after the talk and we give people an opportunity to talk about it and give them spaces potentially on campus where they can talk about how it felt to have that person here, those types of things. We also might want to definitely let people know in advance and have some space for people to talk about it as well. Absolutely, legally, we can do that. There's nothing that says, oh, we have a controversial speaker coming, so we can't promote other types of dialogue or speech on campus. In fact, that's what we can do, and I would argue should do to increase dialogue and discussion. That it's absolutely fine, legal, and chances are very good education policy for a university in these kinds of situations to offer a variety of speakers and events to deal with a variety of perspectives on that particular controversial speaker. We are a learning environment. That is our mission. So speech, how to deal with a controversial speech is speech, more speech. Yeah, other ideas, things we could do.
Consider inviting a super popular, exciting speaker to parallel that person's session.
There's nothing wrong with inviting somebody else for the very same time, right? And the comment here was a super exciting speaker, you know? Someone maybe that other people would want. Again, we need to, if I'm the person who's in charge of deciding what rooms and things like that, I need to follow my content neutral policy on how I decide where rooms are. This super exciting speaker may also cause some disruptions because everybody's so excited to see this super exciting speaker. And so I may have some time, place, and manner restrictions there too. And as long as I'm doing those, following my content neutral policy, that's fine. Yeah. Question or comment here?
You said that the policy has to be content neutral, but we don't publicly, if the controversy is someone that doesn't support university values, publicly clearly stating that.
Yes. So the point here was that I had mentioned we don't have to be in this room content neutral. Our policies need to be content neutral. So if this speaker who has invited themselves to our campus is absolutely antithetical to our values as an educational institution, we can say that. And in fact, I think one of the prime examples of this where I think people on a variety of positions on the spectrum of free speech thought it was well done was the University of Florida. So the University of Florida was very clear that they had not invited Richard Spencer to their campus. He invited himself. He paid for the space. They initially thought about not allowing it, but they realized that under their policies and under the law, they had to allow him to speak, but they didn't have to sit back and be silent. So the president of the university made some comments about how the university had not invited the speaker and that the speaker did not in any way, shape, or form represent the values of the university. In fact, went further from that. But they put it on the homepage of the University of Florida. They had funding for student groups to make videos about their feelings about Richard Spencer coming to campus. They had a poetry slam. They did a number of other events during the whole semester, up to, during, and after the event. Can a university do that? Yes. That's free speech, right? Now, it gets a little tricky for some of us in the room if it's a student group that has invited this speaker, and that's why I kept it to a scenario where the person has invited themselves. If it's a student group that's invited the speaker or that is engaged in speech that some people find incredibly harmful, what we would call hate speech, very controversial, very hateful. The people who work with the student group may need to remain neutral, right? Because they are the ones who have to actually enact that content-neutral policy. But I don't do that. That's not my job on this campus, nor is it President Kaler's job on this campus, or the provost. And so we have seen recently where presidents and provosts and other people in leadership roles, faculty, student organizations, student groups have come out and said, this student group has invited someone to our campus, and they can absolutely do that. And we disagree with what this person stands for, what they say, and we're inviting some other wonderful speakers, and we're having a forum, and we're having a debrief, and we're providing counseling services for people to be, and other supports for people on our campus, because we know this may be very harmful, especially for certain groups of students and staff and faculty. Can we do that? Absolutely, right? Absolutely, and I think we should. If it's that, much on our values. Again, it's supposed to be a free flow of ideas, right? And I think what happens sometimes is we get silenced when we work at a university because we want to promote free speech, and we think that means, well, I can't have a chilling effect on free speech. That's absolutely true. But I also have rights to free speech on this campus, and I should use those responsibly. Right, okay. Other questions, I have a couple more scenarios, but it might be best if we focus on maybe a couple questions and then we'll turn it over to our facilitated dialogue. Yeah.
As a follow-up to what you just said, for non-faculty, non-presidents, provosts,
Right.
who want to share their opinion, what has the court said about, or courts have said about whether or not that person can then be penalized, fired, or somehow have consequences for speaking their mind?
Sure. So, excellent question. So the question is, okay, what if I'm not a faculty member? I have tenure, so that means I can't be fired except for cause. So there's things I could do that are unprotected on this list that would get me fired, but otherwise, I can enact my academic freedom and responsibility and my right to free speech in ways that if you're on a year-to-year contract, you may not feel that you can. So I'm not a provost or a dean, but I work here or I go to school here. What can I do? So first of all, going back to something I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we are very fortunate to have a very strong academic freedom and responsibility policy, and it covers everyone at the University of Minnesota. We, the regents, modified the policy in 2009 to deal with employee speech. So there were some cases wending their way through the Supreme Court where public employees, if they were talking about something that dealt with their job duties, didn't have First Amendment protections anymore. And the case that made its way to the Supreme Court had to do with an attorney who was working in Los Angeles in the district attorney's office, who made some comments about thinking that things weren't being done correctly in the office, to the point of this individual, as an attorney in California, where I do have a license, was obligated by ethical standards to report, did so, and the court said had no protection for that speech. It was a whistleblower, and yet didn't have protection from that speech because it was part of his official job duties. Well, here at the University of Minnesota, that made us very nervous, and we started seeing that case getting applied in K through 12 situations. So our academic freedom and tenure subcommittee or committee here at the university drafted new language, went through the faculty's senate, went all the way to the regents, and they unanimously approved that when you're talking on matters of public concern, even if it's part of your job duties, you are covered by the academic freedom and responsibility policy. Now that goes to everybody except deans and above. A dean who wants to say something about what the provost or the president is doing that they don't agree with, they do that publicly. They may not be a dean, right? And that's the one caveat. But so if you're not a dean or above, this does protect you. Now, that's great that we have that policy. And we're also fortunate that our policy covers everyone and not just faculty, which some academic freedom and responsibility policies have really been tailored just to cover faculty. But it's only as good as the paper it's written on if we can't enact that. And I think that's something that we need to work together on. Some of us, like myself, because I have tenure, I may be able to enact my academic freedom and my free speech in ways that would be very difficult for someone who's on a year-to-year contract. So I have a responsibility to do that, but to use my voice, but I also have a responsibility to make sure that other people can use theirs. And so I'm really interested in finding out ideas about how we can strengthen that, but our regential policy protects us all for things like that. Mm-hmm. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Carmen, and looking forward to this facilitated dialogue. And just thank you all for this opportunity to meet with you today and talk about this, and I hope we continue the conversation. Thanks.